Welcome to today's video, 1 John 1 verse 9 explained. If we confess our sins, He is faithful and just to forgive us our sins, and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. The book of 1 John is a letter written by the Apostle John to early Christian communities. During this time, many believers were struggling with false teachings and confusion about sin, salvation, and their relationship with God. John wrote to remind them of God's truth, to reinforce their faith, and to clarify essential Christian doctrines. 1 John 1 verse 9 comes in the opening chapter of the letter, where John emphasizes the nature of sin and the importance of fellowship with God. He contrasts the darkness of sin with the light of God's holiness, reminding believers of the vital need to confess their sins openly before God. Confession isn't just a one-time act but a continual process for those seeking to walk in the light of Christ. This verse begins with an important condition: if we confess our sins. The word "if" here implies that forgiveness is dependent on a personal act, confession. To confess means to agree with God about our wrongdoings, to admit our faults sincerely and openly. It's not about making excuses or justifying our actions but owning up to them fully before God. When we confess, God is described as faithful and just. Faithfulness speaks to God's unchanging nature. No matter how often we stumble, He remains dependable. He does not turn away from us when we come to Him in humility. God's justice means He acts righteously. Through the work of Jesus Christ on the cross, justice for our sins has already been satisfied. God doesn't overlook sin but ensures that the penalty for sin is paid through the sacrifice of Christ. The next part of the verse promises forgiveness, to forgive us our sins. This is the heart of the gospel message. When we confess, God responds with grace. He doesn't withhold His mercy based on the severity of our mistakes or failures. His forgiveness is total and unconditional, as long as we come to Him with a repentant heart. Finally, the verse says that God will cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Confession leads to more than just forgiveness, it leads to purification. God cleanses us not only from the guilt of sin but also from its stain. This speaks to the ongoing work of sanctification in our lives, where God is continually transforming us to be more like Him. He not only wipes the slate clean but begins to reshape us, removing unrighteousness from our lives and helping us walk in holiness. The phrase "cleanse us from all unrighteousness" points to a profound spiritual truth. Sin is not just an external action, it affects our very being. Sin distorts our relationship with God and others, but God's cleansing is holistic. It reaches the deepest parts of our soul and spirit. This cleansing is a work that only God can do. It's beyond mere human effort or self-improvement. This verse highlights the necessity of dependence on God for true righteousness. Another key insight is the dual nature of God's response: faithfulness and justice. These two attributes work hand in hand. His justice means that sin must be dealt with, but His faithfulness means that He has provided a way for that sin to be covered through Christ. This verse encapsulates the entire message of the gospel: God's unwavering commitment to restore us despite our failures and His just handling of sin through Jesus. 1 John 1 verse 9 calls us to live in humility and openness before God. The first step in applying this verse is to regularly examine ourselves and come to God in confession. Confession should be a regular part of our prayer life, not just when we feel especially guilty or distant from God, but as a daily habit. It's about maintaining an honest relationship with God, where we acknowledge our shortcomings and seek His grace continually. This verse also reminds us of the importance of transparency in our relationships with others. When we sin, whether against God or people, we should be quick to confess and seek reconciliation. Humility in admitting our faults can restore broken relationships and bring healing, just as confession brings spiritual cleansing from God. Additionally, we can find comfort and assurance in the fact that God is faithful to forgive. No sin is too great for His mercy. This truth frees us from carrying the burden of guilt. When we truly understand and believe that God forgives, we can let go of our past mistakes and live in the freedom that Christ provides. Knowing that we are cleansed from all unrighteousness allows us to live confidently as children of God, no longer bound by shame or guilt but walking in the light of His grace. Lastly, this verse encourages us to trust in the ongoing work of God in our lives. Sanctification, the process of becoming more like Christ, is something that God does through His Spirit. As we confess and draw nearer to Him, He continues to purify us and guide us in righteousness. Our role is to remain humble, reliant on His grace, and open to His transformative power. Before we end, if you found this explanation helpful, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, share it with others, and leave a comment with your thoughts or questions. May God bless you as you seek to live in His light and walk in His forgiveness daily.